Hi, I'm Jenny Fish from One Big Happy Yarn Company. We want to be your local yarn shop no matter where you are. Welcome back to the Arcadia Poncho Knit Along. It's time to finish up our poncho. We'll go over the garter ridge edging, weave in the ends, and I'll share tips on blocking larger garments. If you still need supplies, check out our kits at onebighappy.com. Let's get this poncho ready for wearing. So now that you have got your cable twisting and turning and stitching down, and you've worked yourself through one repeat, you go ahead and you continue for the size that you're making, how many repeats you want, or feel free to modify. I worked 8 repeats using an increase every other round, and then I did one final repeat with no increases. Once you get the poncho to the desired length that you want, you're ready to start the edging. Now this is a garter stitch edging in the round, which means you're knitting one round and then purling the next round. And you do that for the desired length that you want. For me, I did 4 inches. The pattern says 3 or 4 inches depending on the size that you're making. I chose 4 inches. The key here is that you need to end after a knit round, so that your next round is ready for a purl, and we're gonna bind off using the purl stitch bind off. And I wanna show you what that looks like here. This is my little sample that I've been working on. My last round was a knit, and now I'm doing this float through the back like a mock that I'm knitting in the round. This is what it'll look like. My last round was a knit. I'm ready to purl, so I'm going to show you the purl stitch bind off. It's not much different than the knit stitch bind off, except for instead of knitting each stitch, I'm purling it. So stick this purl-wise, wrap my yarn around, purl one, then I'm going to purl the next one. Then I take my left needle and I lift the first stitch up and over. Then I purl the next stitch, come through and take this, lift it, oops, don't want to split that yarn, slide it in there, lift it up and over. And I like to do this a little looser than normal, just because it's the edge of my garment. I like to keep that tension a little looser than normal, give it some stretch. So you purl that stitch and then you lift it up and over. And you'll do this all the way around. Then once you're done with that, you just have to weave in your ends. So I've got this end over here. I'm just going to go ahead and show you how to weave in your ends. You'll go ahead and finish binding off all the way around. But I have a little trick for weaving in your ends in garter stitch. So I have my needle here. I'm going to go ahead and thread my needle. And then I like to do a duplicate stitch, and that is where I'm going to follow where I have knitted before, and it hides that stitch in there. So I'm going to go up through here, and basically I'm going to be tracing, see this stitch right here that goes like this? I'm just kind of duplicating that stitch, and it works really well to hide these ends right through there. And I do that for about an inch. Now, if you've used the Russian join throughout the project when you're adding new balls of yarn, then you will only have your beginning and your end tails to weave in. Otherwise, you'll have ends to weave in every time you started a new ball of yarn. Another helpful tip that I have for any project like this where there's a lot of knitting and a lot of wear that's going to go into this project is take a sample of your yarn. It's 18 inches or more, and weave that in underneath in a hidden spot of your garment, like right under here on the back side, maybe right across there. Weave that in leave it there, let it ride along with the project for the washing, for the wearing. That way, if you do get a snag and you need to make a repair later on, you can pick that salvage yarn out and use that to make any repairs later on. It's just a little helpful tip that I like to give out. So there I have woven in those ends. You can barely see them. And then you just simply snip off that yarn and you're good to go. Now you know how to weave in your ends. Now we're ready to block. Okay, so I have finished poncho laid out and ready so I can show you some blocking tips that I like to use. When you have a larger garment like this or a sweater, there's a lot of weight on it when it gets wet. So what we want to do is fold it up. By folding it up, we're taking some of the stress off of each individual stitch when we put it in the water. So I'm going to bring in my bucket here. You'll want to put some wool wash or some kind of like some of your soap that you like to use for blocking. And then we're going to submerge it in the water. And the reason why we block, when blocking, the stitches bloom, they even out. When you get it wet, the water goes into those fibers, fills them up, and then when you're laying it out to get it into the position that you want it to be, and it dries in that shape, as you're laying it out, all those stitches, they just kind of relax and they fall into place, and it really straightens out your knitting, evens out your tension, and gives you a more finished garment when you're done. Now you're going to let this sit for about 15 minutes. You want to give the water time to absorb into all of the fibers. Now once your poncho has set for 15 minutes or so, then we're ready to take it out of the bath. You also want to use like a warm room temperature water. This is an acrylic blend fiber, so you're not going to run the risk of having it felt, which is good. But I still like to go ahead and block it to give those stitches an opportunity to even out. Okay, now I'm also squeezing. I am not wringing, just because I don't want to distort the stitches and pull and tug and have them go in different directions. I want them to stay where they're at, but I just want them to relax. Okay, now we're ready to pull this out of the water. I'm going to slide this over here. I have my towel. Okay, we're going to squeeze this water out. We're going to keep it folded so that we don't put any extra weight and tugging on any of those stitches. We're keeping them all together. Let that water drain out. And then we're going to move it over to our towel. And in this case, you may want to use more than one towel. All right, so we're going to lay this down, keep it somewhat folded still. We don't want any extra pressure on those stitches. Okay, so now we're going to fold this up in our towel. And a lot of times after you do this process, you may grab another towel and do it again to wick more of the water out. But the towel is here to protect everything and to wick out some of that extra moisture out of our poncho. We're going to roll it up. Let me get this over here. And then we squeeze and squeeze. We have the protection of the towel to help keep our stitches in place. Okay. Now we can unroll. And for this one, I found that lying it flat to dry, I didn't need to use any of the blocking pins. I just laid it out. Now feel free to do that process again with a dry towel, wick out some more water, but I'm good here. This acrylic blend is so forgiving and it's so soft. I was very, very surprised after it dried how soft it was. Okay, I'm gonna flip this over one more time because what I'm doing here is I'm making sure my cables are lined up because I'm just gonna lay it flat to dry. And I wanna make sure that my cables are not distorted from underneath. You can kind of feel, peek, they are lined up. Now I'm gonna work outwards on the sides of my poncho. Make sure the edges are lined up, nice and pretty and even. And then for the cowl, I'm just gonna lay that out like that. Make sure I get the wrinkle. There we go. Nice and pretty. Okay, you're gonna wanna let this sit until it's 100% dry. For me, it took about 2 or 3 days until it was completely dry. And the reason for that is if you move it around too much while it's still wet, your stitches might move around and then they might dry and get wrinkled or get out of place. So just let it dry before you move it. And then once it's dry, you're ready to wear it. Congratulations for finishing this super comfy and sophisticated poncho. I love the cables. I think they give that special touch of elegance to an easy to knit project. Again, I had so much fun making this knit along. I hope you've enjoyed knitting along with me and learning some tips and tricks to work cables, use a lifeline, and block to perfection. Remember, you can get a kit with the yarn and the pattern book at onebighappy.com. Be sure to click the bell to be notified every time we have a new video. Happy knitting!